I think that pro players in Valorant and pro coaches and teams have been trolling themselves to start the VCT season. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the teams that have been making some very questionable decisions and why some of your favorite players have not been performing up to the standard that you expect from them. First of all, let's go ahead and talk about NRG. They started the season with a 1-3 record. They just beat Crew recently, but there's been a lot of sort of controversy about how they have been managing their team recently as far as their roles. Specifically, let's talk about Artis, who came into this year as sort of one of last year's superstar op players, hard carry on the Chamber and Jet on basically every map, helping to lead FPX to one of the best positions in all of Valorant worldwide. Now, if we look at his agents played this year, we can see that his most played agent has been Raze, followed by Killjoy, Sage, and then Jet at the bottom. So why is NRG putting their superstar op player, their Jet, their Chamber player on roles like Raze and Killjoy and Sage? And why are they doing this when they have players like FNS, who has been a Sentinel specialist for much of his career? Why are they doing this when you have Victor, who's been one of the better Razes in North America? According to one of the interviews that I saw from them, they decided that they wanted to be less predictable. And that makes sense. We're in a franchise system where every week teams have time to prepare for their next opponent. So there's a lot of anti-stratting that can happen. So I understand the sentiment of not wanting to be too predictable. But what makes me a little bit confused is why would you then play basically the same comp, but just have different players play those agents who are pretty much inarguably worse at the agents than other players that you have on your team. Now, this is no hate to Victor. He's been a great Jet, honestly, this year, but I would still say that Artis is better. And this is no hate to Artis. He's been an okay Raze, but I would say inarguably Victor is just better at Raze. So if you're gonna still play the same agents that you would play anyway, why not just put the players that are best on those agents on those agents? If you want to be unpredictable, it seems like you would probably have to change your comp. And to further illustrate this point, I want to bring up a concept from professional sports and other sort of peak performance type activities called the flow state, or being in the zone. And this is a graph that was created by a scientist who studied the flow state, and essentially it describes how to activate sort of peak performance in a player or a person. And on the x-axis, we have the skill level of that person, and on the y-axis, we have the challenge that they're facing. And we can see that the lower the skill level and the higher the challenge, we lead to a state of anxiety and sort of worse performance because of being afraid or being unable to meet the challenge. And on the other side of things, we have being too good at something and not being challenged enough, leading us to sort of a state of boredom, or not really being challenged enough to bring out the best in somebody. And in the middle, we have where sort of flow state is, where the most fun, the most peak performance experience is had, which is when you are adequately challenged for your skill level. And so you're not really being pressured too much. You feel like you can meet the challenge, and at the same time, you're being challenged enough to sort of elevate your performance. Now, this is the essential for being a great player or a great performer in something, is finding that particular intersection of skill and challenge. So when we look at players who are playing roles that they don't have a lot of experience on, if we look at Artis, for example, and we look at his all-time most played agents, we can see that he has actually 2,600 rounds on Sova, which is a little surprising to me. I didn't realize he'd played this much Sova. But then we look, we've got 1,000 rounds of pro games on Chamber. We've got about 1,000 rounds of pro games on Jet. We've got 500 games of pro games on Raze, and we have 122 rounds of pro games on Killjoy. So I want to use this to illustrate a specific point, which is that there's just no way you could expect Artis to be even reasonably as close to as good as he was on Chamber or Jet when he's playing the Killjoy. He just doesn't have the same amount of experience. And you might be saying, but wait, obviously they're practicing this in scrims. They're scrimming a bunch, they're not just gonna throw him on Killjoy randomly. They've obviously practiced it. To that point, I would say there is simply no comparison between scrim rounds and professional stakes rounds. There's just no way to compare them. What you're practicing in a scrim will not translate directly to what you're practicing in a pro game It's just not possible because the pace of the game, the pressure of the moment, the need to perform, the intensity of the game is just not the same. So if you want Artis to perform at the same level and the same competency and the same fluidness that he has on an agent like a Jet or a Chamber, he's going to need to log thousands of hours and thousands of professional caliber rounds on Killjoy. That requires a lot of time, and it's just something that you simply cannot achieve through practice alone. So it's no surprise to me that his rating, his stats on Killjoy are poor compared to his stats and his rating on Jet. He just has way more experience and way more competency on this agent. And if we look back at this flow state thing, we're essentially taking a lot of these pro players who have kind of made role switches. We can talk about cryo cells on Raze and Omen. We can talk about Artis on these. And we can see that essentially we've taken their skill level from being here and we brought it to being here. And that's a problem because the stakes and the anxiety and the challenge has ramped up significantly since joining the partner league. There's a lot more pressure on these players. So the challenge level has gone up and the skill level has gone down. So a lot of these players are finding themselves in this poor performance state of being too challenged and not skilled enough to meet that challenge. And I think this bears out pretty well if we look at some of the other teams that have performed quite well. Fnatic, every single one of their players has been playing the role they've been playing for basically their entire career. We look at Furia, who's been kind of a surprise this year. All of their players are playing roles that they have played for their entire career. We look at Loud. Their roles have been basically set in stone since the beginning of the season, and they've been performing very, very well. Perhaps one of the more interesting ones is Cloud9. Cloud9 came into this season with essentially no expectations after they got rid of both Ye and Vanity, two super tenured players, very experienced, very good players, and they brought in two sort of unknown players. But what they did do is they fixed their role issues. They suddenly had a dedicated smokes player. They suddenly had a dedicated Sova player, which they had been lacking for an entire year. They'd been trying to, cycle various players into the Sova role ever since they got rid of Zeta on their team, but they've never really had sort of that just hardcore info initiator player. Ye and Leaf had a lot of sort of clash as far as their overlap in roles. Zeppo was trying to just flex to everything. Zelsis was trying to flex to everything. But now that they have gotten rid of Ye and Vanity, suddenly they have 5 players who are just kind of slotted into roles that they've been playing for their entire career. And surprise, surprise, they've been one of the best teams in North America so far. And this brings me to the next point that I wanted to talk about, which is comps, because not wanting to be predictable is a problem when a team has an entire week to prepare for your game. So you obviously do need to switch things up. And the way that a lot of teams have been approaching this so far is to change the roles that players are playing, but play the same agents that they would anyway, instead of changing the agents that they're actually playing. And listen, I've been a coach. I understand how long it takes to develop strategies with one comp. So asking people to have multiple comps playing completely different strategies is super difficult. It's not something that you have time for. I think that there has to be some sort of better understanding about how a comp functions. And I want to just kind of illustrate this point because, for example, if we have a Jet, right? Jet does a couple things super well. Jet is the best opper in the game. So great defensive opper, great aggressive opper. Jet also provides an economic advantage with Bladestorm, right? Bladestorm allows you to kind of like mess with the economy of the game a little bit. And Jet also allows you to enter a site aggressively and break sight lines by dashing into a smoke, right? This is one of Jet's primary purposes in a comp, is to break sight lines and take this aggressive sort of positioning. Let's break down each one of those things. So as far as opping goes, it's very hard to replace Jet's ability to op aggressively, but Chamber can kind of do that. There are places where Chamber can take sort of the exact same angles that a Jet can and still escape. So there is some sort of parallel there. Now, obviously Chamber doesn't have the ability to dash onto a site, but there are other agents that can make a similar aggressive move, right? Neon kind of plays this role. Raze with the satchels kind of plays this role. So there are ways to break sightlines aggressively with other agents. Chamber can kind of replace part of Jet, and then other duelists can kind of replace the other part of Jet. Now, that does leave you with some other problems, and you need to kind of mix and match the pieces to make the comp actually work. When teams start trying to mess with their roles to fake out the other teams, I think they're literally making their team worse and their players worse in the long run. That's my take. Let me know what you think. See you next time.